Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this episode of the Players NIL podcast. And my guest today, for the second time, Mr. Cal Stein, partner at Troutman Pepper. Cal, welcome back.
Hey, Mark, thanks for having me back. I had a blast the last time. Glad to be here.
Well, you're my first repeat customer, as they say, and the timing couldn't be better. Cal, you're an attorney. You're very well versed in NIL, sports business, colleges, collectives, all the things that those of us in the NIL space don't know anything about. So I want to dive into that a little bit. The timing could be more perfect. We've had a recent announcement of an investigation at the University of Tennessee. I think it's their second one, actually. So it brings me to my first point. Is the NCAA all of a sudden going to enforce all of these supposed guidelines? What's going on?
Well, it sure looks that way, Mark. We've been saying for some time now, really over a year, that enforcement of these NIL guidelines is coming. All the signs had been there. The NCAA had said they were going to enforce. They were hiring more enforcement personnel. And it appears that now they're making good on those activities and those actions. I would also point to the change that the NCAA implemented in the charging standard. You may recall that originally the NCAA was having some difficulty, or expressed some difficulty they were having in enforcing the NIL rules because they don't have subpoena power, for example, over third parties. Well, they changed the charging standard, made it a lot easier for them to bring these enforcement actions. And I think that's what we're really starting to see and will continue to see throughout 2024.
So there's some real teeth behind this fight.
Well, the NCAA certainly wants us to believe there is. It remains to be seen what types of sanctions the NCAA ultimately will come down with. We have seen a couple so far: fines, some disassociation penalties with collectives and boosters. But it is important to remember that at the end of the day, the NCAA does only have authority over its member institutions. So it's the penalties it can levy, the teeth for all of these policies really are limited to that.
So my knowledge is limited in this, only what I read in the newsprint. My University of Miami, Florida State, University of Florida, now Tennessee, Southern football schools. Any coincidence? How did they pick these schools to go after first?
Well, there's no real way to know how or why the NCAA picked these particular schools. The way the NCAA conducts their investigations and how they select the investigations to actually pursue is a little bit of a black box. What I think we can infer, or if we're reading between the lines, is that these are schools where the NCAA at least believes there were NIL payments made, or at least nominally NIL payments made, in connection with either the recruitment of student athletes or enticing student athletes from the transfer portal, which is a big area, to come to the schools. And certainly the dollar values of the NIL deals we have seen are biggest in the revenue generating sports, i.e., football and men's basketball. Although I do note the University of Miami investigation involved their women's basketball program, albeit again with the transfer portal. So there's really no way to know exactly what the NCAA is doing or how they select these investigations, but I think you can see the commonalities that exist amongst those they've pursued, at least so far.
So, I know we live in a world that probably doesn't understand a lot of what these guidelines are meant to do or what they are. As a practical matter, I deal with hundreds of athletes a month and 1,000 over the last year. Inevitably, the question comes up: what am I allowed to do? What am I not allowed to do as a high school recruit or as someone considering going into the transfer portal? So strictly by the book, Cal, if I'm a parent of a high school athlete that's being recruited to a Power 4 conference, football, sport, how do I handle this? Because we know what's going on, wink, wink, nod, nod. How do I make sure that my football player's son is in compliance and doesn't jeopardize his career or the school's career? What are the practical answers to this?
It's a difficult question. And right now, and so far, the NCAA has been true to its word about at least one thing, which is that they're going after and punishing the schools. They have not yet punished any student athlete for an NIL violation. And I think that is a fair way to have done things, at least so far. These student athletes are being pulled in many different directions, oftentimes by collectives and boosters who are outside of the NCAA's authority. The NCAA has said from the beginning, we're not going to punish the student athletes, we're going to punish the schools, and they've kept to that at least so far. So that is one thing to keep in mind. The other point, really, and I've done extensive writing and talking about the myriad guidelines the NCAA has come out with on NIL, not to mention the state laws on it. But at the end of the day, it really all boils down to one thing, practically, legally, everything that is prohibited, and that is in using NIL money to induce student athletes to come to a school, either to matriculate there from high school, or as we're seeing more and more, to transfer there through the transfer portal. So if a student athlete is looking to keep himself or herself out of those types of situations, and they don't want to be embroiled in that type of litigation or investigation that we've seen, that's the thing they have to avoid. They have to avoid the inducement, and they have to avoid even the appearance of an inducement. And we've started to see that more and more with the transfer portal and the timing of these NIL deals. You can imagine, for example, an NIL deal being announced, a big NIL deal being announced for a football transfer the day before he commits to a new school. That has a certain perception to it. So, to the extent these student athletes can be aware of that and can avoid those situations, that's going to benefit them greatly.
On the tail of this conversation, NIL deals, transfer portal, seems like there's an increased number of student athletes in the transfer portal of all sports. We're coming out of COVID, so the fifth-year kids are going to be off the board pretty soon. But the kid that got to a school that maybe they're not going to play, maybe they have a coaching change, maybe they're being enticed by other schools to enter the transfer portal because there will be an NIL opportunity greater than what they're in. It seems crazy, but we really do have free agency in full-blown perspective right now. What can we do about it? How do you feel about the transfer portal? Is it a good thing?
Well, I think for student athletes, it is a good thing. Student athletes had long been held to their letters of intent, absent what I'll call kind of extraordinary circumstances, regardless of what the school does vis-a-vis the coach who recruited that player and told him or her, look, I'm going to be here for 4 years. Schools were free to fire those coaches. Those coaches were also free to move and then leave the players behind with really restricted ability to move. That hardly seemed fair. So to some extent, I think the relaxation of the standards and the rules related to the transfer portal is a good thing, and it's certainly a good thing for the student athletes. But you do have to counterbalance that, of course, with the impact, the negative impact it has on coaches, teams, schools. It's really hard to keep a team together. It's really hard for both big and small schools to do that. If you're a big school, for example, and you've got a loaded quarterback room with three blue chip quarterback prospects, only one of them can play. It's hard to keep the other two. And, there's something to be said for those other two finding their opportunities elsewhere without the NCAA transfer rules impeding them. At the same time, the longer we go with NIL, the more organized all of these operations become. And that goes for the big schools as well as the small schools. So an interesting thing that I've been seeing are some of the smaller schools, the group of five schools, the non-power conference schools now have legitimate NIL operations that they are able to take advantage of some of these situations with a blue chip quarterback, for example, who's not playing, to be able to give them that opportunity if they come to the school. So it goes both ways. It's a challenge for coaches, and I think we are starting to see coaches leave the college ranks because they don't want to deal with this. I'm from Boston. Just earlier this week, the Boston college coach left to take a coordinator position in the NFL. certainly didn't say anything, but it's hard not to read between the lines there, and see someone who just doesn't want to deal with recruiting and keeping his own players at the college level, perhaps. So I think we're going to see more and more of that, and I attribute a lot of that to the current state of the transfer portal.
I deal with coaches all the time, and it's worrisome for the big school. For every college coach, they have to re-recruit their kids every year, right? To retention is the word that we use, right? And I don't care if you're at a Division III school and a kid's trying to move up, or a Division II school, or a Division 1 school that's a mid-major, that somebody all of a sudden gets wind that they could possibly play at a larger school. And it's scary. It's challenging. I don't know what the answer is, but it makes me nervous. But my point is, it's not NIL. It's transfer portal equals collective payments. These kids are getting paid to run fast and jump high, and I'm on the bandwagon and on the record as saying REAL, real NIL, is not transfer portal equals or combined with the collective payments. I think the NIL world has been tainted by those stories, right? That's kind of my opinion. How do we get away from transfer portal, collective payments, and real NIL? Is there a difference in your mind, or am I out of my mind?
No, you're not out of your mind at all. And if I knew the solution, I would certainly share it. It's a challenge. And I think part of the problem right now is we've got different stakeholders that are pulling things towards the extreme. So advocates of the student athletes themselves, for example, including the NCAA and its president, Charlie Baker, they've relaxed the transfer rules to give the student athletes more freedom, to allow them to move around, especially when their coaches leave, and to take advantage of NIL. That's a good thing. But then you mentioned it earlier, these recent lawsuits by state attorneys generals who are looking to do away with all manner of restrictions on eligibility and transfer rules. And in my view, that is simply not a workable solution. You can't have a situation where there are no rules at all, because then you do have true free agency, but it's free agency unlike what we have in professional sports, where you have contracts. In professional sports, you have guaranteed contracts where you can go to whatever team you want, but when you sign on the dotted line, you are tied to them for the length of that contract. So you don't have professional teams that have to re-recruit every player every year. It would be the equivalent of professional sports where everyone was on a one-year contract, which would be chaos. It would be mayhem. I don't think anyone wants to go that route, but it's a challenge right now balancing the freedom for student athletes without having these employment contracts with schools that may be coming sooner rather than later. And if it does, that will have a big impact on this whole process.
I want to ask you about athletes as employees, but first I want to ask you about federal legislation. We've had 10 plus hearings on Capitol Hill, multiple athletic directors and even athletes. Chase Griffin was on Capitol Hill a couple of weeks ago. Where do we stand with federal legislation? Are we close, or is it a pipe dream to think that they're going to step in and help us?
Well, I'd like to tell you that we were close. And I think there are a lot of people who would like to tell you that we're close, including the NCAA and Charlie Baker, who have openly lobbied for congressional action here. I have no doubt there are many members of Congress who would like this to be close. We've seen a ton of federal NIL bills that have been advanced through the House in particular. But all that said, I do not believe we are close to federal NIL legislation for a host of reasons. Not for lack of interest. As you mentioned, there are many, many hearings ongoing. There are bills. There's a lot of interest out there. I just think we've got a lack of consensus so far. We've got a lack of consensus among the congressmen and congresswomen who are looking to pursue this. And until we get that consensus, it's going to be really challenging to have any sort of meaningful legislation. And maybe that consensus will come. Maybe that consensus is waiting for the NCAA to act. We've seen some proposals on the NCAA level that would really upend NIL and college sports. It wouldn't surprise me if Congress was waiting to see what happened with those, where that landed before really jumping in with 2 feet. So I don't think we're anywhere near federal legislation. I don't expect we're going to get that close in 2024, especially with it being a presidential election year. I would love to be wrong, but I think we've got some time to wait for that. And as you alluded to, we may see some further legal action in the circuit courts and even the Supreme Court before we get federal NIL legislation.
Leave it to the government to prolong what should be an easy situation. It's not easy. I understand that. Let's talk about athletes as employees. I believe there's no question revenue sharing is coming in one way or another. Is the employment model the right one? What's your opinion?
Well, I don't know if it's the right one. It is certainly one that we seem to be moving towards. If for no other reason than what we have seen from the Supreme Court in the limited opportunities this particular court has had to weigh in on the issue. Now, the Alston decision that we all know in my opinion, spooked the NCAA significantly and substantially enough that they abandoned their amateurism model that they had relied on for so many years and said, okay, we're going to allow NIL. That's the one I look at. And in particular, I focus on at least one comment that Justice Kavanaugh made. And I wrote it down here because I think it's important to get his words right. What Justice Kavanaugh said in the concurring opinion there, he said, nowhere else in America can businesses get away with agreeing not to pay their workers a fair market rate on the theory that their product is defined by not paying their workers a fair market rate. Call me crazy, sure seems to me like at least one member of the Supreme Court is ready to rule on a case and rule that these student athletes can and perhaps should be employees. Now, I do note, Mark, that, if and when we get that decision, which I do think we're probably going to get relatively soon, that's not going to be the end of the inquiry, because once they become employees, or I should say, if they become employees, that actually raises more questions than answers. The big one being Title IX. How would that situation mesh with the well-established rules of Title IX at this point? I don't know, and that is something that absolutely would require, I believe, congressional intervention.
Yeah, I was at the Sports Business Journal conference in Las Vegas in December, and all the big power conference athletic directors were on a panel, along with some athletes. And to a person, none of them wanted the employee model. They just thought there was, filled with potential problems. That doesn't mean they don't want revenue sharing. It's just not the employee model. We're going to get to the last question here, which is most interesting to me. So since NIL was authorized in July of 2021, everyone knows that we have figured out a way to channel money to athletes, whether it's be in the parking lot or in the locker room now, a little bit more transparent, through what is commonly referred to as collective NIL. A collective to me is simply a group of interested parties, alumni, donors, boosters, local businesses, collectively pooling their money to influence recruiting and to influence transfers. That's just the reality of things. We seem to have a lot more NIL administration moving towards colleges and universities inside the walls. We know that running a collective is difficult. We know that there's been a reduction, maybe by 50% of the original collectives because of the operational cost and administrative headaches. What's your thoughts on collectives being rolled into the athletic department in colleges? First of all, do you think it'll happen? Second of all, do you think it's a positive thing, or is it just back to the same people controlling the money that controlled it 3 years ago?
Yeah, so I'd like to say I think it's going to happen, because I think as things are currently constructed, the collectives, who again are outside of the scope of authority of the NCAA, really don't have much incentive or control over them to kind of rein them in. And I think we've seen that. And I think Charlie Baker in particular has commented that the impact of that is that it harms student athletes. We started this discussion by talking about what advice I would give, my son or your son, or a five-star football recruit. It's hard. It's hard because they're dealing with these collectives who have lots and lots of challenges. So I think there are some real benefits to bringing NIL in-house within the universities. I think that's something that if you asked the NCAA and put them on a lie detector test, they would probably admit that is probably a good situation. However, there have been some schools that tried to do exactly that. They tried to bring their NIL operation within one of the existing fundraising arms of the university. And the NCAA came in with a letter and said, hey, can't do that. We're reminding you, schools cannot pay NIL deals directly or indirectly. So the NCAA put a kibosh on that. And I think the reason they did that is because that's what the current rules and guidelines say. And to not say that would require changing them in a way that the NCAA is probably not ready to do. I think we're going to see in 2024 the NCAA make a concerted effort in additional enforcement actions to reach collectives, to have schools disassociate with collectives that are creating problems and control things that way. But if that doesn't work, or if it doesn't work as well as the NCAA wants, we may see a renewed effort to bring NIL in-house in the way you described and the way some of these schools tried before the NCAA told them no.
I agree. It seems inevitable that it's going to go back into the control of the school, which is good and bad, in my opinion. All right, we're getting close to the end here, but I want you to put your genie hat on and look in your crystal ball. Where are we headed with college athletics, Cal? And it's a multi-level question, not just the proposed subdivision that Charlie Baker put out there, but that group, yes. What will that look like? But beyond that, are we going to lose Olympic sports? Is everything going to go to club teams? What's the crystal ball tell you 3 years from now? What will college athletics look like?
Yeah, I mean, this is what I refer to as the big change, right? The big change seems to be coming. It seems to be inevitable, especially on the Division I football level, or should I say the big time Division I football level. The proposal that the NCAA made, or that they're considering, that you just referenced, I think is something that is likely to happen. I'm not sure if it's within 3 years or 5 years, but it just seems like a matter of time before the NCAA institutions that want to compete at the highest level in football, that model does not necessarily fit with the remainder of college sports as a whole. There's a spectrum, of course, as you mentioned. I mean, it doesn't match at all with the Olympic type sports, doesn't even really match with the NCAA men's and women's basketball. It's a little bit closer. But I think eventually we are going to see Division I football, major Division I football, breaking away and being its own thing. And I can only use that vague language because I don't know beyond that what it's going to look like. But where does that leave the rest of the sports? It's a real question and a real problem, because as we know, there are a lot of schools out there whose entire athletic budget is funded by their football and basketball teams. And if that money goes away, how does that impact those Olympic sports? Do they become club sports? Probably on some level. Does that mean there are no scholarships for those athletes? Perhaps. Does that mean, what does that mean for the coaches? What does that mean for the players? None of it would be a positive for those sports, but it's a little hard to say exactly where they go from here, other than being very different than the current status quo.
Well, I think all the issues that you raised are the things that I am worried about as a parent of non-revenue college athletes back in the day. I understand the budgetary limitations, and I've seen college teams with four to a hotel room and brown bag lunch, and I've seen college teams that fly to every game. Right? You get the whole spectrum, and pay for play is real. The club sports scene is real, and at the end of the day, my feeling is, how to use athletics to better your life, and whether it's club sports or high-end Division I sports, still have the same opportunity. I just love what NIL has created, and NIL has created a platform, and I don't know why it took so long, but a platform for athletes to take advantage of their celebrity, right? And that's, at the end of the day, to create lifelong opportunities, whether it be internship, career opportunities, entrepreneurial opportunities. I still love the opportunity that NIL has created for athletes, and I hope that it stays positive.
Yeah, I completely agree. One of the things that I really love about NIL, one of the paradigms that I've seen is the student athlete who can stay in school. He or she doesn't have to move on to that next stage in their life because they need the money or their family needs the money. They're able to continue to be a college student. They're able to continue to work towards their degree and graduate whereas otherwise they may not have been able to. I think that's really an underrated aspect. There are many, many student athletes who have stayed in school longer. And I think in the long run, that's a really good thing for them, in addition to all the other opportunities that you've mentioned, Mark.
Yeah, great. I hope you're right. Cal, it's great to have you back on. It's such an important area of interest, the legal, the NCA, the federal legislation, SCOTUS, all these things. So as this evolves, I may ask you to come back and update us and help explain it, because I'm sure that we won't understand whatever the initial reading is. But you've been a great guest once again. I want to thank you for being on the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me, Mark. I'm happy to come back anytime. As you know, first and foremost, I'm a sports fan, a team sports fan. So when that love interacts with my professional life and the law, I'm happy to talk about it with you or with anybody. So happy to come back. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome.